Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Polk. I'm going to be talking about reduction um, in alarms and just trying to combat alarm fatigue in the ICU. As we all can kind of guess, like alarm fatigue is a huge, huge problem with, upwards of 90% of your alarms throughout a 12-hour shift are false alarms, which if you can imagine the amount of alarms, if you go sit in an intensive care unit for even a couple hours, you'll start to kind of hear the alarms even when they're not going off because you hear them so much. But I think I'm burnout on them. I've done it for a little over a year now, but I think it's so important that we work on ways to reduce the number of alarms per shift just so that, with all this crying wolf, we don't actually miss like a very important change in a patient's condition. And people silence them inappropriately, like most of our techs and everything. That nobody really touches the monitors, but the nurses in the unit that I work on. It's a neuro ICU in Atlanta, just because they know better. But sometimes you tell them, "Hey, just hit silence on that," because it's not a real alarm. Like I don't know how many times I say that per shift, and we can't like really fix the monitors to that. So trying to possibly like tailor the alarms and matching treatable changes, um, because like a lot of the monitors that are in the ICU are set, they're not set specifically like to each person. They just monitor, like they're preset basically to pick up rhythms, uh, and the pickup on the parameters that are like set on the monitor. So you have to make sure that you change them and tailor them appropriately. So the first article that I'm using to support reduction of alarm fatigue um, is prevalence of alarms in the intensive care unit and its relationship to nursing staff levels. So this article went into detail about the number of alarms per shift and tried to make a correlation between excess alarms and short staffing, and saying that you essentially trying to correlate like um, maybe a reduction of staffing could like reduce the alarms, but they really didn't find any correlation between that. But the big thing that I wanted to highlight from that article was that there can be anywhere from 700 to 2,000 alarms in a 12-hour shift on a 12-bed unit, and I tailored those numbers to work like for my unit. So in any given shift you can have about 2,000 alarms in 12 hours, which is way too many, because you usually think about it, you only use one alarm to wake up in the morning. You might snooze it a couple times, but you're not anywhere near 2,000 alarms. So that one, it's very excessive. And the next article that I'm going to use is it's a multidisciplinary initiative to reduce alarm fatigue from unnecessary pulse ox alarms. In this article, they use the pulse ox alarms because that was one of the highest rates of false alarms, was your SpO2 monitoring dropping below 90%. And these things are very sensitive. They any like your if you have the pulse ox on the same arm as your blood pressure cuff, it'll actually cause the line to go flat because it's cutting off circulation, and that causes an alarm just in the middle of taking a blood pressure. And that's one of the things, like we try to just make sure it's not on that same hand. But for this study, what they did was they put a few things together, like to try to combat the alarm fatigue, which was you needed an order to initiate continuous monitoring on a patient. Most patients in the ICU you need it, but some you actually really don't. And then basically just individualizing the parameters based on the patient's condition. Like some patients sit a little bit lower, and you can actually set your parameters lower because you know that they're going to be safe. But that's a discussion that you have to have with your physician, with your respiratory therapist, and everybody has to be in agreement. And within the first month of this trial, they said they reduced their alarms by 77%. And it was specifically the O2 saturation being less than 90%. So as you can imagine, even a 3/4 reduction in alarms based on just that is pretty significant. And the third article that I used was combating alarm fatigue. And this study took place in a Cincinnati Children's Hospital. This study found that there were an average of 5,300 alarms per day, so about 2,500 per shift, 2,600 per shift, and 95% were false alarms. You can imagine that's just very excessive. And of all the other things that you have to do as an ICU nurse, having your alarms going off constantly can be a source of frustration, and then you just kind of, put it out of your mind, and you stop getting up and running to the alarms the way that you would, when say when you first have a patient. But what they did to help reduce alarm fatigue on this unit was they set up where you're changing your electrodes daily, essentially as part of your shift report and shift change, making sure that the parameters are appropriate per the patient, and you can adjust them accordingly, based on, like I said, talking to the physicians, talking to the other nurses, and talking to your respiratory therapist, and also checking for criteria to discontinue monitoring as soon as possible. In an ICU, you're always going to have continuous cardiac monitoring, but if we could take it off sooner, get them out of the ICU sooner, it's really important. So their results were their alarms went from 180 to 40 per day, and reduced false alarms from 95% to 50%. I think that's incredibly significant. So the next part of this, I made my little fishbone here, and you can see on the right hand side there's alarm fatigue in the ICU. And I had three major major subsets here, like the staff, the equipment, and the environment. And these are things that are where the problems are, and exactly where we can fix it. So with your equipment, it's your cardiac electrodes, your monitors, and your pulse ox probes, based on what we're talking about here, because those are the biggest problem areas for false alarms on the monitor. And, as far as staff goes, nurses and respiratory therapists, especially respiratory with your pulse ox, and nurses with the cardiac electrodes. And as far as the environment goes, anywhere there's continuous monitoring, and it's generally in intensive care units, because we have to have, our patients are really sick and they stay monitored, because they can change at the drop of a hat. So as far as the goal for this, it's very specific. The specific goal is to reduce the amount of alarms per shift, which would in turn reduce alarm fatigue. And this is measurable because you can literally just measure how many alarms go off per shift and what they are, and categorize them. And this is achievable based on the research articles that you already saw, where they actually have, measurable reductions in alarms, which is reducing alarm fatigue on their units. And just that's, again, tailoring the monitors and the parameters specifically for the patients, and just making sure that your equipment is properly placed, and just understanding what the alarms actually mean and whether you can adjust them or not. And this is very realistic, because the previous studies actually showed improvement. Like I said, I think it's extremely important, because I come home and I can hear the alarms going off in my head when I get off the unit. Like, that's how many you hear. It's just a constant noise. And this could be, you could really tell, I think, within a few shifts, when you start changing things around. I mean, you would see results probably within a month, but you could see them noticeably within a few shifts if you just implement, proper equipment, that kind of stuff. Okay. All right. So changes. I think the major changes that could be made on any given unit would be, again, not to beat a dead horse, but ensuring proper electrode placement for telemetry monitoring, proper placement of oxygen saturation probes, proper placement of blood pressure cuffs, proper skin prep for all equipment, making sure that your ICP, your EBD, is placed appropriately, and your your drains are leveled. Also your art lines, your arterial lines, making sure that your patient has their arm positioned appropriately to have an appropriate measurement on the monitor, so that the monitor doesn't read it as something else. And just checking the parameters, I can't stress that enough, because different patients when you get into the ICU, you realize that vitals don't fall within a certain set. The standard parameters aren't good for everybody based on the conditions that they have. Like you could, for example, the biggest example is a COPD patient. You could have them, their oxygen saturation probably can sit anywhere from 85 to 90%, but yet we have our monitors set from 90 to 100%, and it just constantly goes off. So understanding their condition, you could actually back their parameters off, and they actually shouldn't be getting too much oxygen, but they should be getting just enough, right? So you can set the monitor parameters between 85 and 90%, and if they drop below that, you might be a little bit concerned, and if they're above that, you would be concerned. But instead of having it just constantly ring off a low alarm. And the big change would be educating nursing staff on EKG rhythms, telemetry rhythms, because it's all right there on the monitor. And if you see something, you can just do an EKG. Proper blood pressure measurements, understanding cuff placement, understanding where and what your measurements would be based on where you have put the blood pressure cuff at, because it's different the further you get away from the heart. And understanding appropriate O2 monitoring, just like I mentioned, and understanding how your patient fits into these parameters. I can't stress that enough. Let's see here. And finally, like as far as the results go, like I can't obviously implement this yet, but I would expect to see a reduction in the number of patient alarms. I would expect to see nurses and respiratory therapists more engaged with their patients and truly understanding what the measurements on the monitors mean. And I would expect the staff to be more engaged because they're not constantly interrupted by false alarms. So you're actually able to focus on like if the patient does have an alarm and it's actually an emergency, you can actually focus on that and you can be more engaged in your patient instead of kind of being tired of hearing their monitor go off constantly. So yeah, and that's all I got as far as that goes. Here's my references. I mentioned those. Those are from the articles earlier, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.